She spent years locked away in Iran's Evin prison. But after rounds of diplomatic wrangling, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is finally back home. Still, dozens of others remain behind bars as governments around the world are accused of using human beings as bargaining chips. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. After almost 6 years and 5 foreign ministers, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is finally free. The British-Iranian dual national was first detained in April of 2016, accused of trying to overthrow the government in Tehran. This was the moment her years-long ordeal began. Nazanin's husband, Richard, fought relentlessly for her release, even going on hunger strike. But despite his pressure on the British government, it still took 6 years to secure her freedom. In her first public address since arriving in the UK, Zaghari-Ratcliffe questioned why it had taken so long.
I was told many, many times that, oh, we're going to get you home. That never happened. So there was a time that I felt like, do you know what? I'm not even going to trust you, because I've been told many, many times that I'm going to be taken home, but that never happened. I mean, how many foreign secretaries does it take for someone to come home? 5? It should have been one of them eventually. So now here we are. What's happened now should have happened 6 years ago.
So why did it take so long? Well, many say Britain's repayment of a decades-old debt was the key issue. Iran had for years demanded the UK government pay back more than $500 million for tanks ordered in the 1970s that were never delivered. International courts backed Tehran, but the British government blamed sanctions for decades of non-payment. Then finally this year, that debt was repaid, and it wasn't long before Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, as well as Anousheh Ansari, also a British-Iranian dual national, were freed. But while the Ratcliffe and Ansari families rejoice, other foreign nationals remain in detention. Iranian-American father and son, Bakr and Siamak Namazi, have been held for almost 7 years. Bakr was arrested while visiting his son, who'd been accused of spying, in 2015. Authorities eventually moved Bakr, now 85 years old, from prison to house arrest over his failing health. In 2020, Benjamin Brière, a French tourist, was also arrested on espionage charges. In December, he went on a hunger strike for 35 days to protest his detention. And in 2021, Iranian-American Ahmad Shargi was convicted of national security violations at a trial he says he wasn't allowed to attend. Shargi was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Tehran, meanwhile, is calling for the release of several of its citizens from U.S. custody, some of which stand convicted of violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. And this kind of wrangling, some call it prisoner swaps, others say hostage diplomacy, is becoming more and more common. In 2018, Canadian authorities arrested Chinese tech executive Meng Wanzhou and charged her with fraud at the behest of the United States. She was freed in September of last year. As soon as her release was secured, Beijing released Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who'd been detained in China accused of espionage. And today, many are concerned with the case of WNBA star Brittany Griner, arrested in Moscow just days before Russia attacked Ukraine. Human rights activists say allegations she was carrying CBD oil cartridges, legal in the United States but not Russia, mean Moscow could attempt to use her as leverage in any potential negotiations with the United States. So are innocent people being used as political bargaining chips? Well, joining me now to discuss that and more is Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and an advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiations team. Jared Genser is in Washington, D.C. He's an international human rights lawyer and has represented numerous political prisoners. Also in the U.S. Capitol is Iranian-American journalist Negar Mortazavi. Thank you all so much for being with us. Mohammad Marandi, I'll start with you in Tehran. I know you may disagree, but it's extremely difficult at this point to deny that Zaghari-Ratcliffe's release was not connected to the debt payments finally delivered by the UK government. So let me ask you this. Does it worry you that someone Iran convicts of a serious crime was in the end, at the very least, seen to be used as leverage to collect on a debt?
Not at all. Who says she was innocent in the first place? What is the evidence to say that she was innocent?
Does the timing, if she was not innocent, if that's what you're saying, and then the
After
timing
all, if
happens
she's
to be
innocent,
that she was released and freed because this debt was paid, if she was indeed guilty, does that not disturb you that this, even just the optics, look this suspicious?
well, when there is an exchange between two hostile countries, when spies are exchanged, when compensation is offered, when the different sides are negotiating, these things happen. She was not innocent. Boris Johnson, when he was the foreign secretary, admitted in Parliament that she was teaching so-called journalism in Iran. She had no right to do that, A. B, of course, the British media was outraged because he made that admission, because it proved that she was doing something illegal, and then he had to backtrack. So basically, the Western media, the British media, was telling the government to shut up and not to tell the truth. And the Iranian intelligence, they have the documentation that she was teaching encryption, that she was teaching how to infiltrate different organizations to gain information, and that if their cover is blown, what should these so-called journalists do? What has a person who's working for a Western news agency or a Western government media outlet, what right does she have to do? What right does she have to be doing this in Iran, in a country which the British and the Americans and NATO are so hostile to? Two young Iranians, just a while back, were charged in the United States, two young Iranians in Iran, I presume, were charged in the United States for interfering in U.S. elections because they apparently sent emails to people in Alaska warning them that they must vote for Trump. Why is that something that no one protests about in the Western media? So if it's an Iranian, they're assumed guilty, whatever the charge is, no one protests. And if it is someone who is affiliated to the West, the person is automatically innocent. In an exchange, these things will happen. The British government took hundreds of millions of dollars of Iranian money hostage. They prevented Iran from taking those weapons because they were supporting Saddam Hussein. They were supporting him with weapons, preventing Iran from being able to defend itself, and supporting Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons. Since I survived two of those attacks, I know about these things quite well. So no, if anyone has taken hostages, it is the British, it is the Americans, it is NATO, and it is European countries.
Okay, so Jared Genser, Professor Marandi sees a double standard here, at the very least. But looking at Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's case, I'll put it in simple terms. Tell me what example you actually think it sets for international diplomacy.
Look, I mean, I think it's quite clear that Iran has been taking hostages, not just from the United Kingdom, but from the United States and more than a dozen other Western countries since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This isn't just my view or the view of the United States or the UK. This is the view of the United Nations. I represent Siamak and Baher Namazi, two Americans who have been detained in Iran. Siamak for more than 6.5 years in Evin prison. Baher Namazi, if we're going to talk about the rule of law, Baher Namazi was not only first released under a furlough in Iran, but then, in fact, his time in prison was commuted to time served because of serious health issues that he had. And he's been unallowed to leave Iran for more than 2 full years, even though under the Iranian legal system, his case was commuted to time served and his bail was released, and he should be able to leave the country at any time, and yet he's barred from leaving the country. But in the cases of my clients, Siamak and Baher Namazi, in more than a 20-page decision, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that they were illegally detained and demanded their release. And it also noted that there have been findings of arbitrary detention relating to a range of other people in Iran that have been dual nationals, and this is not just a unique set of circumstances, et cetera. But I'll say, look, I mean, I don't know the evidence in the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, because all of her due process rights were violated. Right, the trial was a secret trial. There was no evidence presented in public, and I'm just saying this as an international lawyer looking at this from the outside perspective. So you're supposed to be presumed innocent, not presumed guilty, as your guest suggests. And it's the duty of the Islamic Republic, if it wants to convict a person and sentence them to jail, to abide by all internationally protected due process rights, because they are a state party to an international treaty called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which requires specific rights of due process to be provided that are not provided in these kinds of cases.
So, I mean, Jared, I imagine your suspicion is here that Iran is holding on to Bakr and Siamak Namazi to eventually use as some sort of leverage, if possible, in the future.
Well, they've actually been told that. They've been told that directly by Iranian government officials.
The problem...
Namazi were told by prison officials, you're not going to be able to get out of jail until the Americans pay.
And the bigger problem, I think, in some respects, is that these governments are now arguing that, it's credible to say these cases are not connected to any government dealing somehow, that it's merely coincidence that a release or a swap happened at the time of some serious diplomatic tension or geopolitical disputes. It's as if they just don't want to acknowledge the obvious elephant in the room that these people are being used in international diplomacy.
Well, look, I mean, I think, I can't imagine any person, although obviously anyone's entitled to their opinion and to express it, I can't imagine anybody arguing that these are not hostage exchanges which are taking place. The same thing happened in January 2016 when the JCPOA came into force. Right at that exact moment, 5 American hostages were released. Unfortunately, not Siamak Namazi, the only left behind, but in exchange, as widely and publicly reported, for hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. So I think that to have a debate over whether these are hostage exchanges or not, for me, is not a debate that's based in facts. It's it's based in political positions and political posturing. It's quite clear to me, and to I think most of the world, at the United Nations as well, that these are hostage swaps and that these are not ordinary releases that just simply happen by operation of the rule of law.
Professor Marandi, I can see you disagree. I can give you a quick reply. I'd like to get Negar in the conversation. Do go ahead quickly if you can.
Well, I think this is a one-sided debate, and obviously the assumption is that these are hostages so that they're innocent. Why? Because they're Europe, the white world, the Americans. They say that, and therefore that is the assumption. No, we don't abide by your criteria. We have our own criteria. We have our own courts. Everyone in Iran, all these sabotage attacks on Iran, all these assassinations, all these murders, they just happen. These are people who are killed because of espionage. They're people who are killed because of Western infiltration. Let's not be silly and childish. It's obvious what Western countries do in Iran. We all know it. So let's not pretend that people who come to Iran are all innocent when they're arrested. That's, in my opinion, racist and Orientalist. The reality is that I know people in the United States who've been in solitary confinement for years on trumped-up charges simply because they were pro-Iran, such as Sayyid Mahmoud Mousavi, who ran an Islamic center in Southern California. I wrote a deposition for him. He was in solitary confinement for 2 years. He got cancer in jail. They removed his tongue, and he died soon after being released. He was charged for all sorts of things. All of them turned out to be nonsense. The problem was simply because he was pro-Iran. Or a host of different Palestinians
You've made your point again that you feel there are a number of double standards.
For simply giving.
Understood.
Let's not pretend that your guess is objective.
Okay, it's not about objectivity necessarily. It's about having different opinions on this subject.
A genocide.
Professor Marandi, if you don't mind, I do need to get equal time to our guests. So let me move to Negar quickly, and I want to bring up something that Professor Marandi alluded to, and that was, Iran using evidence that Boris Johnson, who then foreign minister, they feel presented, saying that that Nazanin was in Iran to teach journalism. Everyone had said that was not true. Her case, as they feel, was proven. She was there to visit her family. However, when he said that, Iran took that as evidence to the contrary. And we know in the case as well of Bakr and Siamak Namazi that a not very well-known U.S. writer for the Daily Beast did some pretty serious damage as well to the Namazis in reporting that they were a, quote, shady family working for the Iran lobby with no proper proof to that line of allegation. Iran took that and ran as well. Many saw it that way. So what role do journalists actually have when it comes to not skewing the cases of these people taken into custody in third countries like Iran and elsewhere?
Well, Andrea, I believe it was in the Daily Beast, and it wasn't even a real name. It was a fake, sort of a pseudonym piece that was all attacks and smears against the Namazis. Look, I want to be fair and objective, try to give a two-sided view here. Yes, this is all about the geopolitics, the political, the years-long, decades-long political disputes between these countries. These are hostile countries to each other. The United States, at times, under various administrations, has actively pursued a strategy and policy of regime change. There are assassinations of Iranian officials, of Iranian scientists in Iran. There are sabotages. Iran has a reason to fear and to have this paranoia. What the problem is here is that it seems to be directed at the wrong people. It seems to be targeting people, and as Jared says, and I agree with him, in a lack of due process, in a lack of any resemblance on what you would call proper justice. There are people who seem to be the wrong people that then eventually turn into political pawns and are used in this international diplomacy. So the geopolitics and the hostility is very much there, and it's a fact and it's correct, but these people are not necessarily the ones who are responsible for the type of charges that's projected against them, and we haven't seen real evidence, as you are saying. And a lot of times, again, the dealings are very much behind the scenes because both governments, frankly, don't want it to be very transparent. The UK side also is not really acknowledging that they settled the tank debt in exchange for the dual national prisoners. So a lot of behind the scenes is happening as observers, as the public, as international lawyers. We don't have access to a lot of the information, but what seems clear is a lack of due process, of proper process of justice, and also of targeting the wrong people, essentially, at times. I'm sure the Iranian side, Iranian security forces, do occasionally catch spies or people who are engaged in espionage, but not necessarily everyone who's caught in this game is one. And also, just to add one point on the U.S. side, I believe the Iranians who are detained in the U.S. or on behalf of the United States and other countries because of U.S. economic sanctions imposed on Iran, that's also unfair. It's a kind of financial dealing that's only criminalized for Iranians that a Turkish person, a Pakistani national, or any other dual national can very much freely do. But for Iranians, it's criminalized, and they end up serving sometimes long prison sentences. So that's also unfair, but that doesn't justify the wrong that's happening on the other side.
Okay. Jared, if I can come back to you because there's another issue at play.
May I make a point?
Please, quickly. I do want to give all of our panelists equal time. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say that Iran has not charged her because of what Boris Johnson said.
It was
the
part
Iranian
of the evidence that they
was
used against her.
Was following her. They have recorded her classes. No, they were basically saying that the U.S., the British government, made it an admission that she was violating the law. Otherwise, when do Iranians or others in the United States who are arrested, they're not, those security trials are not open for us to see. We have Iranians in the United States who've been on trial, and they never get a fair trial. People at Guantanamo Bay or elsewhere.
Okay.
This person was conducting classes in Iran, and they were not ordinary classes. That's quite clear. And it's quite obvious that the Iranian
I know that is the Iranian
case. You cannot assume that she's innocent. When you
I know that is the Iranian case.
Why can't you assume a person is innocent? There is the presumption of innocence is guaranteed under Iranian law and international law. According to our Iranian counsel, you're presumed innocent in Iran, not presumed guilty.
The Iranians have their own evidence. We don't need you to tell us that.
Right. We know there are very much different interpretations of what constitutes proper evidence. But either way, Professor Marandi, I'd like to speak about some other angles of this story that are also very important. Let me go back to Jared quickly. Jared, is it right, do you think, for a country like the UK to kind of pay off, this debt in order to apparently secure the release of what many consider to be a political hostage, and then say, well, it's okay because we know Iran is under very severe international sanctions? Many say that these could be used to terrorist ends, these funds being paid back. But Iran has somehow guaranteed, I guess, that this payment will be used for humanitarian purposes. So how can the due diligence be done on that? And is there a risk that those funds paid back could go to something untoward or more dangerous, and that this is a dangerous game being played by paying for the release of certain prisoners?
Sure. Well, look, first of all, I've never claimed to be objective. I'm a lawyer representing my clients, Siamak and Bakr Namazi. I will say it's very hard for me to do my job because the Iranian courts wouldn't give the Namazi family any actual evidence that was used against them. We haven't even been able to get a copy of the judgment in their case. So when I argued the case at the United Nations, I had to go based on third-party reporting from Iranian state media. And this is why I make very clear that that the due process rights have been so severely violated that I can't even see what the alleged evidence even is. But when it comes to payments for the exchange of hostages and these kinds of things, the bottom line is I come at this from the family's perspective, where Siamak Namazi has been in jail for 6.5 years. Bakr Namazi is in jail for about 3 or 4 years and is now trapped in Iran. And I'm simply trying to help them get their family back to the United States. They're all American nationals as well. And so, it's a bit kind of above our collective pay grade as advocates for families about how this all happens. Undoubtedly, I mean, this is a violation of the Convention Against Hostage Taking, which forbids a country from taking people into detention for purposes of exchanging them for something of value, which is what has repeatedly happened, quite clearly. Again, not my view. This is the view of the United Nations, of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Those are objective bodies. I'm not claiming to be objective because I'm a family representative as a lawyer for the Namazis.
Okay,
Seriously.
So Negar, let me ask you quickly. I mean, do you feel, though, that this entire phenomenon, as some call it even hostage diplomacy, as you know, is actually getting worse? I mean, has the precedent now been set that if you kind of trump up charges sometimes against a foreign citizen in your country, you can get concessions?
Well, Andrea, let me make a couple of points. I think it's different because I've seen some people call the money ransom. Settling a debt is different from paying straight up ransom. This was a debt from looking just at the UK government. This debt was over 40 years overdue. It was something that had been agreed even by the UK government and in courts that is due to Iran, and the UK government just kept delaying it. So in a way, of course, the Iranians hold primary responsibility for detaining Nazanin and the horrible 6 years that she went through, but there's also some responsibility on the UK side for not paying this debt 6 years earlier, as she just said in a press conference yesterday, if this was something that could secure her release in a diplomatic exchange. And also, let me make another point that this is coming from the Foreign Secretary, from the UK Foreign Secretary, that the funds have been ring-faced only to be used for humanitarian purposes, meaning medicine, food, and humanitarian items through international mechanisms and monitoring. So there's no other purpose that this $400 million debt that was settled can be used. But overall, of course, again, going back to the geopolitics, as long as the hostility exists, as long as let me just finish. As long as this type of relationship, and it's a two-way road, I think that's what I'm trying to be fair here. As long as the hostility exists, unfortunately, I think this type of behavior is going to continue to happen. The paranoia towards dual nationals. I'm a dual national myself, an Iranian-American, and I have fear of traveling back to my country because I'm afraid the same thing might happen to me. It's arbitrary. It's this sort of paranoia towards different types of people. So I think, unfortunately, it will continue unless relations normalize and these countries stop having this type of policies and views towards each other and having human beings essentially becoming the victim in the political
Negar
fight.
Mortazavi, I will have to give you the final word. I'd like to thank Mohammad Marandi and Jared Genser so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Very unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm Andrea Sankey. Do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I will see you next time.